Have you ever wondered how a simple act of kindness could change not just one life, but three? A struggling waitress, a dying artist, and a daughter filled with resentment are brought together in an unforgettable story of forgiveness and legacy. What secret did the artist leave behind, and how will it shape their futures? Stay tuned to find out. And hey, share with me where you're watching this video from. I'd love to know. The streets of Duluth, Minnesota lay silent under a heavy blanket of snow. The wind howled through the town, rattling street signs and slicing through the thickest coats. Megan Carter tugged her scarf tighter as she pushed through the diner's back door, exhaustion painted across her face. Her shift had been grueling as usual, filled with impatient customers and the ever-present anxiety of overdue bills waiting for her at home. The parking lot was a sheet of ice, her footsteps crunching against the packed snow. She climbed into her car, a battered sedan with rust creeping along its edges. The engine coughed twice before roaring to life, a small miracle in the freezing temperatures. Megan gripped the wheel tightly, her breath fogging up the windshield as she pulled out onto the icy road. It wasn't long before the faint figure appeared in her headlights. At first, she thought it was a pile of snow someone had pushed into the street. But as she drew closer, she realized it was a man in a wheelchair, struggling to push himself through the snow. His thin jacket did little to shield him from the bitter wind, and his movements were labored, his breath visible in the cold air. Megan hesitated, her hands gripping the wheel as she slowed to a crawl. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It was late, and she was beyond tired. Her apartment wasn't far, and the warmth of her blankets was calling her name. "He's not my responsibility," she muttered under her breath, though the guilt crept in almost immediately. The car idled for a moment longer before Megan sighed heavily. She rolled down the window, the icy air stinging her face. "Do you need help?" she called out, her voice carrying over the howling wind. The man stopped, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheels of his chair. He looked at her, hesitant, before nodding slowly. "Yeah, I could use a lift." Megan stepped out of the car, the cold biting at her fingertips as she folded the wheelchair and struggled to fit it into the trunk. By the time she helped him into the passenger seat, her hands were numb. "Thanks," the man said softly, his voice barely audible over the heater blasting in the car. "It's freezing out there," Megan replied, forcing a small smile. "You're lucky I came by." The man chuckled, his breath still visible in the cold. "You didn't have to stop. Most people wouldn't." "Well," Megan said, pulling back onto the road, "I guess I'm not most people." They drove in silence for a few moments, the only sound the hum of the heater and the crunch of tires against snow. "I'm Robert," he said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. "Megan," she replied. "Where are you headed?" "The hospital," Robert said, his tone quiet but firm. Megan glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He looked weary, his face lined with the weight of 1,000 untold stories. She wanted to ask more but thought better of it, focusing instead on the road ahead. When they arrived at the hospital, Megan helped him out of the car and unfolded his wheelchair, her hands shaking from the cold. Robert settled into the chair and looked up at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and something unspoken. "You've done something much bigger than you realize," he said cryptically before wheeling himself toward the entrance. Megan stood by her car for a moment, watching him disappear through the hospital doors. A strange feeling settled over her, a mix of warmth and unease. She shook her head and climbed back into the driver's seat, the words lingering in her mind as she drove home. Megan shut her apartment door behind her, leaning her weight against it as the cold from outside seemed to seep into the small, drafty space. The faint smell of mothballs and cheap cleaning products hung in the air. She flipped on a single overhead light, which flickered briefly before settling into a dim glow, illuminating her peeling wallpaper and mismatched secondhand furniture. Her living room doubled as a dining area, with a small, wobbly table surrounded by chairs she'd found at yard sales. Megan pulled off her boots and tossed them onto the fraying rug by the door. Her breath was visible as she moved toward the thermostat and turned it up a few degrees, knowing the higher heating bill would only worsen her financial woes. In the tiny kitchen, Megan placed a frozen dinner into the microwave. As it hummed to life, she sat at the table and pulled out a stack of envelopes. The sight of past due stamped in red ink on several of them made her stomach twist. She ran her fingers through her dark, unkempt hair, her mind already calculating how to stretch her next paycheck. As she sifted through the bills, her thoughts drifted to the man she had picked up earlier that evening. Robert. His gaunt face and the way his breath fogged the car's window stayed with her. And his words, "You've done something much bigger than you realize," lingered like a riddle she couldn't solve. Megan sighed and pushed the bills aside, her appetite suddenly gone. She stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. The streetlights cast a soft glow and the flakes fell silently, blanketing the world in an eerie stillness. A rare warmth flickered in her chest. Despite her exhaustion, despite the crushing weight of her responsibilities, helping Robert had felt meaningful. It had been years since she felt like she'd done something that mattered. Most days were a monotonous grind. Wake up, work 2 jobs, pay what bills she could, and hope her car didn't break down again. But tonight was different. For the first time in a long time, Megan felt like she'd made a difference. She sat back down at the table, resting her head in her hands. A voicemail notification flashed on her phone. She tapped the screen and the familiar voice of Joanne, her best friend, filled the room. "Megan, it's me. Look, I know you're always busy and always doing good for everyone else, but maybe, just maybe, it's time someone did something for you. Call me when you get this, okay?" Megan chuckled softly. Joanne always had a way of knowing when she needed to hear the right words. The microwave beeped, breaking her thoughts. She retrieved the steaming meal, setting it on the table, but she barely touched it. Her mind was too occupied with the questions swirling about Robert. Who was he? What had he meant by those words? Why was he out in the freezing cold, alone and vulnerable? As she cleared her plate and prepared to head to bed, her phone buzzed again. Megan frowned, noticing the number was unlisted. She hesitated for a moment before playing the voicemail. "Hello, this is James Callahan. I'm calling on behalf of Robert. He wanted me to deliver something to you." The message ended abruptly, leaving Megan staring at her phone in confusion. Who was James Callahan? And what could Robert possibly want to deliver to her? Her heart raced as questions filled her mind. She knew this encounter wasn't over. Something bigger was happening, something she couldn't yet comprehend. Megan woke up to the pale morning light streaming through her bedroom window. The snowstorm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a serene white stillness. She lay in bed for a few moments, her mind flitting back to the events of the previous evening. The man in the wheelchair, Robert, his cryptic words and the voicemail from James Callahan, kept replaying in her thoughts like a melody she couldn't shake. Reluctantly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, the chill of the hardwood floor biting at her bare feet. The heater had struggled through the night and the apartment still felt uncomfortably cold. She wrapped herself in a thick cardigan and shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee. As the aroma filled the air, she grabbed her phone from the counter and replayed the voicemail from James. "Hello, this is James Callahan. I'm calling on behalf of Robert. He wanted me to deliver something to you." The message ended just as abruptly as it began, leaving Megan with more questions than answers. Who was James Callahan? And why was Robert involving her in something that seemed far more significant than a simple act of kindness? Megan sat down at the small kitchen table, cradling her coffee mug in both hands. Her practical side told her to ignore the call. "You've got enough on your plate," she muttered to herself, glancing at the stack of overdue bills still sitting in their familiar spot. But her curiosity gnawed at her resolve. Robert had seemed so sincere, so grateful. What could he possibly want to deliver? Her fingers hovered over the phone. Before she could second-guess herself, she dialed the number from the voicemail. The call was answered on the second ring. "Hello, this is James Callahan." A voice greeted her, calm and professional. "Hi, this is Megan Carter. You left me a voicemail last night about Robert," she said hesitantly, gripping the mug tighter. "Ah, Miss Carter, thank you for returning my call. Robert asked me to deliver something to you personally. He wanted to express his gratitude for what you did for him last night." "Gratitude? I just gave him a ride. It wasn't anything extraordinary," Megan replied, her voice tinged with confusion. James chuckled softly. "To you, it may seem small, but to Robert, it meant a great deal. He asked me to assure you it's nothing to worry about. Would it be possible to meet you later today?" Megan hesitated. I'm working a shift at the diner this afternoon." "Perfect," James interrupted. "I can stop by during your break. Just let me know the time." Reluctantly, Megan agreed. "Okay, sure. I'll be on break around 2:30. "Thank you, Miss Carter. I'll see you then," James said before hanging up. Megan stared at her phone for a moment, unsure whether she had made the right decision. The knot of apprehension in her stomach tightened as the day unfolded. The diner was bustling by the time 2:30 rolled around. Megan wiped her hands on her apron, glancing nervously toward the door. She had told her manager about the brief meeting, but she still felt self-conscious about inviting someone into her chaotic world. The bell above the entrance jingled, and in walked a sharply dressed man carrying a sleek leather briefcase. James Callahan looked completely out of place in the humble surroundings of the small-town eatery. His polished shoes and tailored coat were a stark contrast to the worn floors and Formica countertops. "Miss Carter," James greeted her with a warm smile as he approached the counter. "Hi," Megan replied, forcing a polite smile. "Let me grab us a booth." Once seated, James opened his briefcase and pulled out a plain white envelope. He slid it across the table toward Megan, his expression kind but unreadable. "This is from Robert," he said simply. Megan stared at the envelope for a moment before picking it up. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a neatly folded note and a check. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the note. "Dear Megan, in the brief moment we crossed paths, you showed me a kindness I hadn't experienced in years. It reminded me that people still care. I've arranged for this small gesture as a way of saying thank you. You deserve it. Robert Carter." The check slipped from her fingers, landing on the table. She stared at the amount, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. $50,000. Her heart raced, a mix of shock, disbelief, and confusion flooding her senses. "This can't be real," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I barely know the man." James leaned forward, his tone gentle. "Robert insisted. He wanted to make sure you had this. It's not about what you did. It's about who you are. He sees something in you, Miss Carter. Something worth investing in." Megan shook her head, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. She wanted to argue, to push the envelope back across the table, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of her struggles, her overdue bills, and her constant fight to stay afloat crashed over her all at once. Before leaving, James placed a hand on the table. "Robert also wanted you to know there's more, if you're willing to hear his story." Megan watched him walk out of the diner, her mind spinning with questions and emotions she couldn't yet articulate. She clutched the envelope, staring at the check, the note, and the signature that had the power to change everything. Megan sat at her small kitchen table, the check still lying in front of her. The amount, bold and undeniable, stared back at her. $50,000. It felt like an impossible number, something she could only dream of. And yet, there it was. Signed, sealed, and addressed to her. Her mind churned with a mix of emotions, disbelief, gratitude, and a gnawing sense of guilt. She rested her elbows on the table, pressing her hands against her temples. What had she done to deserve this? She had only stopped to help a man in need, something anyone should have done. Accepting this money felt wrong. It felt like charity, and Megan had spent her entire life fighting to stand on her own 2 feet. The weight of her bills loomed in the background, her overdue rent, the car repairs she could no longer postpone, and the ever-present struggle of living paycheck to paycheck. The check could ease her burdens, maybe even give her some room to breathe. But at what cost? Was it worth compromising her pride, her sense of independence? The sound of her phone buzzing pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Joanne. Megan hesitated, then answered. "Hey, Joe," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Megan, I've been meaning to call you all day. What's going on?" Joanne's voice was warm and familiar, a comforting reminder of their long-standing friendship. "Something strange happened," Megan began, her words halting. She explained the encounter with Robert, the mysterious James Callahan, and the envelope containing the life-altering check. When she finished, there was a pause on the other end of the line. "Megan," Joanne finally said, her tone thoughtful. "Why does this feel like you're trying to talk yourself out of something good?" "It's not that simple, Joe," Megan replied, frustration creeping into her voice. "This is a lot of money. It doesn't feel right. I don't deserve this." "Don't you?" Joanne countered. "Megan, you've spent your entire life helping others, even when you didn't have much yourself. Maybe it's time to let someone help you for a change." Megan bit her lip, Joanne's words stirring something deep within her. Could she really see this gift as an opportunity, not a handout? A few days later, Megan was tidying her apartment when a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find James Callahan standing there, his coat dusted with snow and a familiar briefcase in hand. "Miss Carter," he greeted her with a polite smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." "No, it's fine," Megan replied, stepping aside to let him in. The warmth of the small apartment was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. James wasted no time. He reached into his briefcase and handed her a second envelope. "This is from Robert," he said simply. Megan opened it cautiously, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was another note, written in the same neat handwriting. "Dear Megan, if you're reading this, it means you've accepted my first gift, or at least you're considering it. There's something else I'd like to share with you, something that means even more to me than money. If you're willing, I'd like you to visit my home. James can provide the details. Thank you, Megan, for reminding me of the good in people. Robert Carter." She read the letter twice, her heart pounding. The words were simple yet profound, carrying a weight that made her question the true depth of Robert's intentions. "What does this mean?" Megan asked, looking up at James. "Robert believes you're someone special," James replied. "Not just because of what you did, but because of who you are. He wants you to understand why this matters to him. If you're willing, I can take you to his home." Megan hesitated, the conflict playing out visibly on her face. Part of her wanted to refuse, to retreat into the safety of her ordinary life. But another part, the part that had been touched by Robert's kindness, knew she couldn't ignore this. "All right," she said finally, "I'll go." The drive to Robert's house was quiet, the snow-covered streets lending a surreal stillness to the journey. Megan sat in the passenger seat of James's car, her thoughts a whirlwind of questions and doubts. What could Robert possibly want to show her? What would she find at his home? As they pulled into the driveway, Megan's breath caught. The house was modest yet inviting, a single-story structure with a snow-covered yard and a porch light glowing warmly. It wasn't ostentatious, but there was something about it that exuded comfort and care. James parked the car and turned to her. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Megan nodded, though she wasn't sure if she truly was. She stepped out into the crisp winter air, her boots crunching softly against the snow. As she approached the front door, she hesitated, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Whatever awaited her inside, Megan knew one thing for certain. This visit was going to change everything. Megan stood on Robert's porch, her breath visible in the crisp winter air. The modest house before her seemed alive with quiet history, its weathered wooden siding and delicate porch railing hinting at years of care. Her fingers hesitated on the doorbell, but before she could press it, the door creaked open. James Callahan stood there, his professional demeanor softened by a welcoming smile. "Come in, Megan," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. The warmth of the house enveloped her as she crossed the threshold, though the interior was far from extravagant. Vintage furniture filled the space, each piece bearing the patina of time. Shelves bowed under the weight of countless books, their spines a kaleidoscope of colors. On the walls hung paintings, bold and intricate, each one telling a story Megan couldn't yet grasp. Despite its age and simplicity, the home radiated a quiet elegance that contrasted sharply with her own barren apartment. "This way," James said, leading her to the living room. Robert was seated in a plush armchair, his wheelchair parked beside him. A soft blanket covered his legs, and his frail hands rested on his lap. His face lit up when he saw her, a genuine smile breaking through his otherwise weary expression. "Megan," he greeted, his voice warm yet strained. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure if you'd accept my invitation." Megan felt a lump in her throat as she took in his fragile frame. "Of course," she said, lowering herself onto the couch across from him. "Thank you for inviting me." The conversation started slowly, each of them treading carefully. Megan learned that Robert had once been a well-known art teacher and painter. His passion for nurturing young talent had been his life's work, but everything changed after a car accident left him paralyzed. Over the years, he had become isolated, the world outside his home growing smaller with each passing day. "I used to have a studio," Robert said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "It was my sanctuary. But after the accident, I couldn't bring myself to go back. The brushes, the canvases, they reminded me of what I'd lost." Megan listened intently, her earlier apprehension giving way to empathy. "That must have been incredibly difficult," she said softly. Robert nodded, his eyes distant. "It was. People started seeing the chair instead of me. They'd either pity me or avoid me altogether. But not you, Megan. That night, you looked past all of it. You saw me. His words hit her like a wave, stirring emotions she wasn't ready to confront. She shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. I couldn't leave you out there, she said finally. It didn't feel right. And that's why I chose you, Robert said, his gaze steady. You have something most people have forgotten. Compassion. It's rare, Megan, and it's why I wanted to share something with you. Robert gestured to James, who handed Megan a small envelope. Inside was a single key and a handwritten note. Megan, this key opens the door to my old studio. I haven't been there in years, but everything inside is as I left it. There's something waiting for you there. Something I couldn't finish. Maybe you can. Robert. Megan stared at the note, her pulse quickening. I don't understand, she said, looking up at Robert. What do you want me to do? I want you to see it, Robert replied simply. What you do after that is up to you. His response left her with more questions than answers, but she sensed there was no point pressing further. Robert's frailty suggested he was holding back much more than he was revealing. The sun was beginning to set as Megan left Robert's house, the key and note clutched tightly in her hand. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as she climbed into her car. The studio. What could possibly be waiting for her there? And why did Robert believe she was the one to finish whatever he had started? As she drove home, she couldn't resist the urge to open the envelope again. This time, she noticed a faint imprint on the back of the note. Tilting it toward the light, she saw the words, "It's not just art, it's a legacy." Megan's heart raced as she folded the note and placed it carefully back in the envelope. Whatever this was, it was far bigger than she had anticipated. The morning sun peeked through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the snow-dusted streets. Megan gripped the wheel of her car as she drove toward the address James had given her. Her mind swirled with questions about what she would find at Robert's studio, her heart racing with both anticipation and apprehension. Snowflakes floated lazily through the air, adding to the sense of quiet as she approached the destination. The studio was nestled between a quaint bookshop and a bustling cafe, its faded sign reading, Carter's Creative Studio. Megan parked and sat in the car for a moment, staring at the building. The chipped paint and frost-covered windows gave it a ghostly charm. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out into the cold and made her way to the door. Inside, the studio was eerily silent. The faint smell of paint and aged wood greeted her as she crossed the threshold. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the space like a forgotten time capsule. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with paint cans, brushes, and art supplies. Unfinished canvases leaned haphazardly against the walls, each one a glimpse into Robert's soul. Megan wandered through the room, her fingers trailing over the rough edges of canvases. Each painting told a story: vibrant landscapes, intricate portraits, and abstract bursts of color. One particular painting drew her attention, a portrait of a young woman with fiery red hair and a radiant smile. The title beneath it read, Sarah. The name sparked something in Megan. She remembered Robert mentioning his estranged daughter. Was this her? The emotion in the painting was palpable, as if Robert had poured all his longing and regret into the brushstrokes. Megan found herself staring at it for longer than she realized, a lump forming in her throat. As she moved further into the studio, she noticed a locked cabinet tucked into a corner. Beside it lay a small key, clearly left there for her. Megan hesitated, her mind racing with the possibilities of what could be inside. With trembling hands, she unlocked the cabinet and opened it. Inside were letters, photographs, and journals, all neatly organized. Megan picked up a journal and flipped through its pages. Robert's handwriting was elegant but shaky, his words a window into his past. He wrote about his successes as an artist, his passion for teaching, and the adoration he once felt from his students. But as Megan read on, the entries grew heavier with regret. He wrote about his strained relationship with Sarah, how his obsession with his art had led to neglect and hurt. He recounted the pain of losing her trust, and how his accident had only deepened the chasm between them. One line stood out to Megan. If I could paint her forgiveness, it would be my masterpiece. Tears welled in Megan's eyes as she read. She couldn't ignore the parallels between Robert's regrets and her own feelings of invisibility in the world. She thought about her own life, The sacrifices, the struggles, and the overwhelming sense of being unseen despite all she gave. Among the letters, Megan found one addressed to Sarah. The envelope was worn, as if it had been handled countless times but never delivered. She opened it carefully and read Robert's heartfelt words. "Dear Sarah, I've made so many mistakes, but the greatest of them was letting you slip away. I can't undo the past, but I hope one day you'll let me try. This studio was always meant for you. It was supposed to be our space. I'm sorry I made it my own instead. If you find it in your heart to forgive me, maybe we can create something new together." The letter was signed with a simple "Dad." Megan clutched the letter to her chest, her heart aching for both Robert and Sarah. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to help mend what had been broken. She knew she couldn't ignore the call to action Robert had placed upon her. Determined, Megan began searching through the cabinet for any clue that could lead her to Sarah. Her fingers brushed against the edge of a photograph tucked inside one of the journals. It was a picture of Sarah as a young woman, standing in front of the studio with a wide smile. On the back of the photo was a phone number, scribbled in faded ink. Megan's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. She stared at the number, her mind racing with doubt. Would Sarah even want to hear from her? Would she reject the connection Megan was trying to build? Taking a deep breath, Megan dialed the number. The line rang, each tone stretching endlessly. Finally, a voice answered. "Hello? Hi, this is Megan Carter," she began, her voice shaking. "I'm calling about your father, Robert. He asked me to reach out to you." The silence on the other end was deafening, but Megan could hear the faint sound of breathing. Her heart pounded as she waited for a response, her mind racing with possibilities. Megan stared at her phone, her thumb hovering over the number she had dialed into the keypad. The worn photograph of Sarah lay on the table beside her, its faded edges a stark reminder of the time lost between father and daughter. She took a deep breath and pressed call. The line buzzed, and after a few rings, a voice answered. It was sharp and curt. "This is Sarah," the voice said. Megan swallowed hard. "Hi, Sarah, my name is Megan Carter. I'm reaching out about your father, Robert." There was a pause, but it wasn't a welcoming one. "I don't know why you're involved, but whatever he's trying to do, I'm not interested." Sarah's tone was cold, each word slicing through Megan's nerves like a blade. "Wait, please," Megan started, her voice cracking, but the line clicked dead before she could say anything more. She lowered the phone to the table, her hands trembling slightly. The rejection stung, but it also fueled her resolve. She couldn't walk away. Not when she had seen the pain etched into Robert's life, nor the hope he seemed to place in her ability to help mend this fractured bond. Later that afternoon, Megan found herself in Joanne's coffee shop, the familiar hum of chatter and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee providing a small comfort. Joanne, her childhood best friend, slid a steaming mug across the table to her. "So, how did it go?" Joanne asked, leaning on her elbows. Megan sighed. "Not great. She hung up before I could even explain." Joanne tilted her head, her expression a mix of empathy and curiosity. "Can you blame her? If what Robert said is true, she's probably been carrying a lot of hurt for a long time." "I know, but it feels like this is more than just about them. It's unfinished, and if I don't try, I'll regret it forever," Megan said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Joanne nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "Then try again. People build walls for a reason, but walls can come down. It just takes persistence, and sometimes a little kindness." Encouraged by Joanne's words, Megan decided to reach out to Sarah again, this time through a heartfelt text message. She drafted and rewrote the message multiple times before finally settling on something simple but sincere. "Hi, Sarah. I know you don't want to talk, but your father's health is failing, and he deeply regrets the time he lost with you. I think he's hoping for a chance to make things right. If you're willing, I'd like to meet with you just once. No pressure. Please let me know." Megan stared at the screen for what felt like hours before pressing send. The weight of the message hung over her as she placed the phone down, her chest tight with anticipation. Hours later, as Megan was washing dishes, her phone buzzed. She dried her hands hastily and picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Sarah's name on the screen. The reply was short and to the point. "I'll meet, but only once. This doesn't change anything." Megan's hands trembled slightly as she typed a response, thanking Sarah and suggesting they meet at a park near her home. The arrangement was set for the following afternoon. The park was serene, its snow-covered paths winding through bare trees. Megan arrived early, the cold biting at her cheeks as she clutched the letter Robert had written to Sarah. Her nerves were frayed, but she was determined to see this through. When Sarah arrived, her presence was striking, tall, poised, and dressed in professional attire that seemed out of place in the snowy park. Her guarded demeanor was evident in the way she crossed her arms and avoided direct eye contact. "You're Megan?" Sarah asked, her tone as sharp as it had been on the phone. "Yes," Megan replied, offering a small, hesitant smile. "Thank you for coming." Sarah didn't respond immediately, her gaze drifting to the snowy ground. "Let's get this over with," she said finally, her voice clipped. Megan handed her the letter, her hands trembling slightly. "This is from your father. I think it says more than I ever could." Sarah took the envelope, but didn't open it. "He always had a way with words. Too bad he didn't have the same way with actions," she muttered. The tension between them was palpable, but Megan pressed on. "I don't think he's trying to make excuses. I think he just wants a chance to say what he couldn't before." Sarah's eyes flickered with something, anger perhaps, or maybe sorrow. Why now? Why not years ago, when it actually mattered? "Maybe because he didn't know how," Megan said softly. "But he's trying now. That has to mean something." For a moment, the icy wall around Sarah seemed to crack. She nodded slightly, slipping the letter into her coat pocket. "I'll read it, but don't expect me to forgive him." Megan nodded, understanding the weight of Sarah's words. "That's not for me to ask. I just hope it brings you some clarity." As Sarah turned to leave, Megan watched her walk away, her posture stiff and her steps purposeful. But just before she disappeared down the path, Sarah glanced back. The flicker of doubt in her expression gave Megan a glimmer of hope. Megan sat in the middle of the studio, her knees drawn up to her chest as she leaned against an old work table. Around her, the room was filled with Robert's unfinished paintings, their muted colors and incomplete lines whispering fragments of his life. The meeting with Sarah replayed in her mind, her sharp tone and guarded expression echoing with unspoken pain. Megan couldn't help but see herself in Sarah's distance, in the way she shielded herself from hurt. Her thoughts drifted to her brother, Caleb. It had been years since they last spoke, a bitter argument over money and family obligations driving them apart. Megan had always meant to call, to bridge the gap, but life and her pride kept getting in the way. Now, she wondered if helping Robert and Sarah reconcile could be the push she needed to mend her own broken ties. The journals lay scattered around her, their pages worn and smudged with ink that seemed to bleed with regret. Megan flipped through them, searching for something, anything, that might help her understand how to approach Sarah again. One entry stopped her cold. "I chose my work over my family, and I see now how much it cost me. Sarah needed me to be a father, but I was too consumed by my art to notice. I failed her." Megan closed the journal and rested her head in her hands. She could almost feel the weight of Robert's words pressing down on her, the desperation of a man who had lost what mattered most and couldn't find a way back. She wondered if this was why he reached out to her, because he saw someone who might understand what it meant to feel invisible in your own life. Drawn by an unexplained pull, Megan wandered toward the back of the studio. There, hidden beneath an old drop cloth, was a canvas much larger than the others. The cloth resisted at first, the years of dust holding it in place. But with a final tug, Megan uncovered what lay beneath. It was a portrait, unfinished yet breathtaking. A young girl, no older than 10, stared back at her with wide, curious eyes. Her golden hair caught in mid-movement, as if a soft breeze had just swept through. The brushstrokes were alive with emotion, capturing both the girl's vibrancy and the tenderness of the artist who painted her. The title etched at the bottom read, "Sarah." Megan's breath hitched. This was Sarah, innocent, full of life, and untouched by the bitterness that now defined her. The painting felt like a love letter, an apology, and a plea all at once. Robert had never stopped thinking about his daughter, even as the years and silence stretched between them. The painting stirred something deep within Megan. She couldn't leave things as they were. Not for Robert, not for Sarah, and not for herself. She needed to speak to Robert again, to understand the full story behind their estrangement and why he thought she could help fix what was broken. But more than that, Megan felt a growing sense of purpose. For the first time in years, she felt like her actions might truly matter. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the studio floor, Megan gathered the journals and prepared to leave. She glanced at the portrait one last time, its unfinished edges mirroring her own unresolved life. That night she pulled into Robert's driveway, the soft glow of his porch light illuminating the snow-covered yard. She barely had time to knock before the door opened. James stood there, his usually composed demeanor replaced with an air of urgency. "Megan," he said, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk. There's something you don't know about Robert's time left." Megan's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" James gestured for her to come inside, his grave expression confirming what she feared. Robert's time was running out. Megan's hands trembled as she followed James into Robert's house. The usually quiet space felt heavier today, the air thick with unspoken truths. James led her to the living room where Robert sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and drawn. Megan barely recognized the man who had once exuded quiet strength. James cleared his throat, his words cautious yet firm. "Megan, there's something you need to know. Robert's condition. It's worse than he's let on." Megan's heart clenched. "How bad is it?" James hesitated, then met her gaze. "It's terminal. The doctors say he only has weeks left, maybe days. He didn't want to burden you with the details, but I thought you should know." The words hit her like a freight train. Megan turned to Robert, who offered a weak, apologetic smile. "I didn't want pity," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Later, Megan sat across from Robert, her mind racing. "You should have told me," she said softly, the hurt in her voice evident. Robert leaned back, his eyes distant. "I've lived with this for years. I've made my peace with it." "But what about Sarah?" Megan pressed. "She deserves to know. She deserves a chance to say goodbye." Robert's face tightened, and for a moment Megan thought he might retreat into silence, but then he sighed deeply and began to speak. "She was only 12 when her mother died," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't know how to be both a father and a mother, so I threw myself into my art, thinking if I just created something meaningful it would fill the void. But all it did was push her further away." Megan watched as Robert's hand trembled on the armrest of his chair. "By the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. She had already left for college, and every call, every letter, it all felt like too little, too late." Megan reached out, placing her hand over his. "You made mistakes, but you're trying to make amends now. That has to count for something." The next morning, Megan sat at her kitchen table staring at her phone. Her conversation with Robert replayed in her mind, each word laden with a sense of urgency. She knew she had to reach Sarah, but the thought of facing her resistance again made her stomach churn. Taking a deep breath, Megan dialed the number. Sarah's voice on the other end was as curt as ever. "What is it now?" Megan steadied her voice. "Sarah, I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But your father doesn't have much time left. If you wait too long, you might lose the chance to say what needs to be said." There was a long silence. Megan held her breath, afraid Sarah might hang up again. But then, her voice softened, just slightly. "I'll meet you," she said. "But only once, and this doesn't change anything." Megan exhaled, relief washing over her. "Thank you. Let's meet at the studio. There's something there I think you need to see." Later that day, Megan sat with Robert, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "She's agreed to meet me at the studio," she said. "It's a start." Robert's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you, Megan, for everything." As the evening wore on, Megan noticed a subtle change in Robert's breathing, a slight hitch that hadn't been there before. Her chest tightened with a growing sense of urgency. Time was slipping away faster than she had anticipated. She clasped his hand, silently vowing to make every moment count. Megan arrived at the studio before dawn, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows through the frosted windows. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. She flicked on the dim overhead lights and surveyed the space. Dust motes danced in the air, and the smell of aged wood mixed with faint traces of turpentine. She moved deliberately, placing Robert's paintings and journals around the room with care. Each piece was a story, a fragment of his love, regret, and longing. Megan pulled the cloth off the large portrait of Sarah as a child and carefully positioned it at the center of the room, propping it against a weathered easel. The painting's vibrant colors stood in stark contrast to the muted tones of the studio, its presence commanding attention. Megan stepped back, her hands on her hips. "This has to work," she murmured to herself, her breath visible in the cold air. She glanced at the clock. Sarah would be here any minute. The sound of hesitant footsteps broke the silence. Megan turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She was wrapped in a long coat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if bracing against more than the cold. "Thanks for coming," Megan said gently, offering a small smile. Sarah nodded curtly, her eyes scanning the room. "This is different." Megan didn't push. Instead, she stepped aside, giving Sarah space to explore. Sarah wandered through the studio, her footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floor. Her gaze landed on the unfinished portrait of herself, and she froze. Her lips parted slightly, her tough exterior faltering as she stared at the vibrant image of her younger self. "He never finished it," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Megan approached cautiously. "He never stopped thinking about you, though." Sarah turned sharply, her eyes flashing with anger. "Then why didn't he act like it? Why did he wait until now, until he's dying to care?" Megan placed a steadying hand on Sarah's shoulder. "He's made mistakes, no question. But he's trying to make amends. That has to mean something." They sat together on a worn bench in the corner of the studio. Megan handed Sarah one of Robert's journals, its leather cover cracked and worn from years of use. Sarah hesitated before opening it, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. She stopped at an entry and began to read aloud. "Sarah, I failed you when you needed me most. Every stroke of my brush since then has been an apology I didn't know how to say out loud." Sarah's voice cracked and she snapped the journal shut. "Why now? After all these years, why should I believe he means it?" Megan met Sarah's gaze, her own eyes glistening. "Because regret isn't enough. He knows that. And now he's trying to do more. But it's up to you if you'll let him." The studio fell silent, the weight of Megan's words hanging heavily between them. Sarah looked down at her hands, her defenses slowly crumbling. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I'll go," she said, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "But only because I need answers. I'm not making any promises." Megan exhaled, relief washing over her. "That's all anyone can ask." As Sarah turned to leave, her eyes lingered on the portrait of her younger self one last time. Megan watched her go, her chest tight with hope and uncertainty. Once Sarah was out of sight, Megan began tidying up, her hands brushing against the journals scattered across the desk. That's when she noticed it, a small, forgotten notebook tucked behind a stack of papers. She pulled it out, its cover marked with the faint scrawl of Robert's shaky handwriting. For Sarah. Megan's heart raced as she opened the notebook, its pages filled with sketches, notes, and messages meant for Sarah. It was a treasure trove of Robert's thoughts, his love, his regrets, and his hopes for reconciliation. She clutched the notebook tightly, realizing its significance. As she left the studio, the notebook in hand, one thought consumed her. Would this be the bridge to bring father and daughter back together? The room was silent, save for the ticking of an old clock on the mantel. Robert sat in his wheelchair, his hands resting uneasily on the armrests. Megan stood by the window, glancing occasionally at the door. Both of them seemed to hold their breaths, waiting for the inevitable. Then came the knock. Robert's gaze darted to Megan, his expression a mix of hope and fear. Megan offered him a reassuring nod before crossing the room to open the door. Sarah stood there, her posture stiff, her eyes guarded. She stepped inside with an air of reluctance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Thank you for coming," Robert said, his voice barely audible. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not here for pleasantries. Let's get this over with." The three of them settled in the living room, though settled felt like the wrong word. Sarah perched on the edge of her chair, her body angled away from Robert as though ready to bolt at any moment. Megan sat off to the side, her presence quiet but steady, a bridge between father and daughter. Sarah broke the silence first. Her voice was sharp, though it trembled at the edges. "Do you even know what it was like growing up with you? You were there, but you weren't. I could have been invisible for all you cared. Everything revolved around your art, your canvases, your brushes. They mattered more than I ever did." Robert didn't respond immediately. He sat motionless, his head bowed as if each word struck him like a blow. "And then Mom died," Sarah continued, her voice cracking. Do you know what that was like for me? To lose her and feel like I'd lost you too? I needed you, but you were too busy hiding in your studio, painting your regrets instead of dealing with them. Megan's hands tightened around the fabric of her skirt. She wanted to interject, to ease the tension somehow, but she knew this moment belonged to them. Robert finally looked up, his eyes glistening. "You're right," he said simply. His voice was hoarse, weighted with years of unspoken guilt. "I failed you in ways I can never undo. I was selfish, blind, consumed by my own grief and guilt. I didn't know how to be what you needed, and by the time I realized it, it was too late." Sarah's jaw clenched, her anger warring with the unmistakable pain in her father's voice. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Robert continued, his voice breaking. "I know those words don't fix anything. They're not enough. But they're all I have left." The room was thick with emotion. Sarah stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Megan thought she might stand and leave. Instead, Sarah turned to Megan. "You seem to know him so well," she said, her tone tinged with bitterness. "Why don't you tell me why I should believe any of this?" Megan met her gaze evenly. "Because regret is heavy, Sarah. I've seen how much it's weighed on him. And because trying even now matters more than giving up." Sarah looked away, her defenses cracking just slightly. She sank back into her chair, exhaustion creeping into her posture. Robert watched her silently, his eyes pleading. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. "But I hope you can find some peace, for yourself, if not for me." Megan's gaze drifted to the table beside Robert, where a journal sat prominently. Its cover was old and worn, and across the front, in Robert's careful handwriting, was a single name: Sarah. Sarah's eyes followed Megan's, landing on the journal. Her brow furrowed as she reached for it, her fingers hesitating on the edge of the leather. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's yours," Robert said. "I wrote it for you, a long time ago." The room fell silent again as Sarah cradled the journal in her hands. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she sat there, her expression shifting between anger, sadness, and something else, something softer. Megan exhaled quietly, the tension in the room easing ever so slightly. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. The journal felt heavier than it should in Sarah's hands. She glanced down at the cover, her name written in Robert's neat, deliberate handwriting. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing over the worn edges of the leather before opening it to the first page. The words stared back at her, raw and unfiltered. "Sarah, every painting I created after you left was a reflection of my guilt. I painted to remember you, to keep you close in the only way I knew how." Her voice wavered as she read the passage aloud, the sound filling the quiet room. Megan sat nearby, silent but supportive, while Robert remained still, his gaze locked on his daughter. Sarah swallowed hard and continued to read. The entries flowed like a confession, each page peeling back layers of her father's emotions. "I know I failed you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I hope one day you'll see that every mistake I made came from a place of fear. Fear of losing you. Fear of not being enough." The journal's raw honesty began to chip away at Sarah's defenses. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages. Then she reached an entry that made her breath catch. "Today marks another anniversary of your mother's passing. I promised her I'd take care of you, and I failed. Every year this date reminds me of that failure. But it also reminds me of how much I love you, even if I couldn't show it." The words blurred as tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. She set the journal down, her voice shaking. "I didn't think you cared," she whispered. "I thought I was just an afterthought." Robert's voice broke the silence, soft yet resolute. "You were never an afterthought, Sarah. You were everything to me. I just didn't know how to show you that." The room was thick with emotion. Sarah's walls, carefully built over years of resentment, began to crumble. She wiped her eyes quickly, trying to steady her voice. "You say that now, but where were you when I needed you, when I cried myself to sleep wishing you'd notice?" Robert's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. "I was lost in my own grief, Sarah. I thought if I poured everything into my work, I could somehow make things right. But all it did was push you further away." Megan shifted in her seat, sensing the fragile connection forming between them. "He's trying now," she said gently, her voice breaking the tension. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's a start. Isn't that what matters? Megan stood and motioned for Sarah to follow her. She led her to the adjoining room, the studio, and pointed to a large, unfinished painting covered with a protective cloth. With a quiet nod of encouragement, she gestured for Sarah to unveil it. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding as she pulled the cloth away. The portrait that greeted her took her breath away. It was of her as a child, bright-eyed, smiling, full of life. Every detail was rendered with painstaking care, from the curve of her lips to the glimmer of mischief in her eyes. "You painted this for me?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Robert wheeled himself closer. "I painted it because I didn't know how else to keep you close. Every brushstroke was a way of saying the things I couldn't find the words for." Tears spilled freely down Sarah's cheeks as she stared at the portrait. The love and regret captured in every stroke were undeniable, speaking louder than words ever could. She turned back to Robert, her expression a mix of sorrow and longing. "Do you really think we can fix this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Robert met her gaze, his own eyes glistening. "I hope so," he said simply. "But it's up to you." The room fell silent, but it was a silence filled with possibility, of healing, of redemption, of a future that might finally bridge the gap between them. The tension from their emotional exchange lingered as Megan suggested they visit the studio again. Robert hesitated, his health visibly fragile. But before Megan could offer to help, Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady but hesitant. "I'll push the wheelchair," she said. Megan's eyebrows lifted in surprise, and even Robert seemed momentarily taken aback. But he didn't protest as Sarah gripped the handles and began navigating him toward the studio. The act, small as it was, felt monumental, an unspoken acknowledgement of the fragile bridge they were building. Inside the studio, the air seemed heavier with memories. Sarah walked slowly, pushing Robert with care, but her eyes darted around, lingering on unfinished paintings and sketches. Megan followed quietly, letting the moment unfold. One particular sketch caught Sarah's attention. It was of her as a teenager, sitting under a tree in their backyard, her face turned away as though lost in thought. She ran her fingers over the delicate lines, her expression softening. "You remembered everything, didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert nodded from the wheelchair, his face clouded with regret. "I remembered everything I didn't say and everything I should have done," he admitted. Sarah continued her exploration, pausing at a half-finished painting of their old family home. The details were vivid. Red bricks, a tire swing hanging from the oak tree, sunlight streaming through the windows. She blinked back tears, her memories colliding with the image before her. "You have these memories," Sarah began, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. "But I was there, living it. Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep wishing you'd come check on me?" Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Robert closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping further as though the weight of her pain was tangible. "I know," he whispered, "and I failed you. But I don't want to fail again, not while there's still time." Megan stepped in, sensing the tension reaching its breaking point. "He's trying, Sarah," she said gently. "He might not have all the answers, but he's opening a door. It's up to you to decide if you want to walk through it." Sarah turned to look at Megan, her expression torn. She wanted to believe in the possibility of healing, but the scars of the past were deep. Slowly, she nodded, her gaze shifting back to Robert. As they prepared to leave, Sarah paused in front of the family home painting. She lifted it carefully and placed it in front of Robert. "If we're going to move forward," she said, her voice steady, "we'll need to finish this together." Robert's eyes glistened and he nodded, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the painting. The room filled with a tentative hope, fragile but undeniable. The moment was interrupted when Robert suddenly gasped, his body going limp in the wheelchair. His breathing turned shallow, uneven, and panic rippled through the room. "Robert!" Sarah cried, rushing to his side. Megan immediately grabbed her phone, calling James. Her voice was sharp, urgent. "We need to get him to the hospital, now!" As the weight of the moment settled in, Megan locked eyes with Sarah. They both understood. Time was running out. The fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room hummed softly, their sterile glow contrasting with the chaos swirling in Sarah's mind. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. Megan sat beside her, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. Across the room, James paced near the window, his phone pressed to his ear. Sarah's eyes flitted toward him briefly before dropping back to the floor. The weight of unspoken words between her and Robert pressed on her chest like a stone. "What if it's too late?" Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I waited too long to forgive him?" Megan turned toward her, her hand gently resting on Sarah's trembling shoulder. "You're here now," she said softly. "That's what matters. He knows you care, even if it's hard to say out loud." Minutes felt like hours as they waited for news. Finally, James returned, his expression grim but composed. "He's stable," he said. "But his condition is critical. They're allowing visitors, if you're ready." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her coat. Megan gave her a reassuring nod. "You can do this," she whispered. Taking a deep breath, Sarah rose to her feet, her legs feeling like they might give out beneath her. She followed James down the sterile hallway, Megan trailing closely behind. The air felt colder as they approached Robert's room. Inside, the beeping of machines was the first sound Sarah registered. Robert lay in the hospital bed, his frail frame barely making an impression on the white sheets. His eyes fluttered open as Sarah hesitantly stepped forward. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice weak but laced with warmth. "Thank you for coming." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She moved to the chair beside his bed and sank into it, her hands trembling as they rested on the edge of the mattress. "I don't know if I can forgive you completely," she began, her voice breaking. "But I want to try. I want us to have something, even if it's not perfect." Robert's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's all I could ever ask for," he replied, his hand inching toward hers. For a moment she hesitated. But then, she placed her hand in his. His touch was light, fragile, but it carried a weight she hadn't expected. Megan stood near the door watching the scene unfold. A quiet sense of fulfillment settled over her as she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A simple act of kindness had led to this, a moment of connection, fragile yet profound. Her thoughts drifted to Robert's legacy and what it meant to carry it forward. She felt an unexpected resolve building within her, a desire to honor the lessons she'd learned from him and the bond he was slowly repairing with Sarah. The moment was interrupted by a soft knock. A nurse stepped into the room, her face etched with a professional calm. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice low, "but there's something else we need to discuss about Robert's care." The tension in the room thickened as the nurse's words hung in the air. Sarah turned toward Megan, her expression a mix of fear and determination. Whatever the nurse had to say, it was clear this wasn't over. The sterile walls of the consultation room seemed to close in as the doctor delivered his news. Sarah sat stiffly, her hands clenched into fists in her lap while Megan leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. "He's stable for now," the doctor began, his voice calm but measured. "But his heart is failing. His body isn't responding well to treatment. At this stage, it's only a matter of time. You'll need to make decisions about his care soon." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. The words echoed in her mind. A matter of time. How could she decide what was right for a man she'd only just begun to understand again? She glanced at Megan, her eyes searching for reassurance. Megan reached out, her hand briefly touching Sarah's. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. Later, back in Robert's hospital room, the atmosphere was heavier, tinged with an unspoken finality. Despite his frailty, Robert's voice carried a steadiness that surprised both women. "I don't want to spend my last days hooked up to machines," he said firmly. "I want to go home, to the studio. That's where I belong." Sarah hesitated, her gaze shifting to Megan, who offered a supportive nod. The conflict inside Sarah was palpable. Was this about what Robert truly wanted, or was it a selfish desire to keep him alive just a little longer? "You don't have to decide now," Megan said gently, sensing Sarah's turmoil. "But we need to honor his wishes." In the corridor, Sarah's emotions spilled over. "How am I supposed to decide something like this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "I've barely had time to forgive him. What if I let him go and regret it for the rest of my life?" Megan placed a steadying hand on Sarah's shoulder. "This isn't about your guilt," she said, her tone calm but firm. "This is about Robert and what he wants. It's not just about the time he has left, it's about how he spends it. This is his legacy, Sarah. It's more than the paintings. It's about making peace with himself. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "You're right," she whispered, "but it still feels impossible." The decision was made later that evening. With James's assistance, arrangements were made to transport Robert back to his studio under hospice care. The following afternoon, as the sun set over the snow-dusted streets, Robert was settled into the familiar surroundings of his creative sanctuary. The studio was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors. Sarah stood by the window, her arms crossed, watching the light fade. The room was a museum of Robert's life. Canvases of unfinished work leaned against every surface, each piece a fragment of a story untold. As Robert rested in a chair by the fireplace, Sarah approached him hesitantly. She looked at the room, then at him. "You really couldn't imagine being anywhere else, could you?" she asked, her voice soft. Robert smiled weakly. "This place, it's always been home, even when I didn't deserve to call it that." Megan busied herself sorting through boxes of Robert's belongings. As she opened an old wooden chest, her eyes fell on an envelope resting at the top. Its surface was worn, the words "For Sarah and Megan" scrawled in Robert's familiar handwriting. Megan hesitated, her fingers brushing the paper. She glanced at Sarah, who was still deep in thought by the window, and quickly tucked the envelope into her coat pocket. Now wasn't the time. As the evening stretched on, the room grew quieter, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a strange sense of connection to her father. The paintings surrounding them weren't just art. They were pieces of a legacy she had only just begun to understand. But as Sarah turned to look at Robert, his shallow breathing and pale complexion reminded her of how fleeting this moment might be. The quiet hum of life filled the studio as sunlight streamed through the large windows, painting the room in warm hues. Robert, now confined to a reclining chair, seemed more at peace than he had been in weeks. His eyes wandered over the canvases and sketches that defined his life, and a faint smile played on his lips. Megan bustled about, arranging pillows and blankets to ensure Robert's comfort, while Sarah stood by the far wall, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of an unfinished painting. The sight of her father surrounded by his art was surreal. Despite his frailty, there was a vitality to him in this space, a sense of completeness that had been missing before. "Do you think he's happier here?" Sarah asked quietly, glancing at Megan. Megan looked over her shoulder and nodded. "This place is part of him. It always has been." While Robert dozed, Sarah and Megan began sifting through the stacks of sketches and journals that cluttered the studio. Sarah hesitated before opening a leather-bound book, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. The sketches inside were a window into her childhood, moments she hadn't realized Robert had noticed, let alone remembered. The first drawing showed her on her first bike, a wobbly figure with a determined expression. Beneath it, Robert had written, "She didn't fall, not once, my fearless girl." The next was a sketch of her high school graduation, her cap tilted awkwardly on her head, a beaming smile on her face. "Proud doesn't begin to cover it," the note beneath read. But the one that stopped Sarah cold was a simple, heart-wrenching image of her sitting by a window, her knees drawn to her chest after her mother's funeral. "I should have gone to her," the caption read. "She needed me, and I stayed in my studio." Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she closed the journal, clutching it to her chest. Megan reached over, squeezing her hand in silent support. Later that afternoon, Robert stirred, his voice weak but steady as he called for Sarah. She approached cautiously, unsure of what he wanted to say. Would you finish a painting with me?" he asked, his voice trembling with both vulnerability and hope. Sarah blinked, taken aback. "You want me to help you paint?" Robert's smile widened, and for a moment he seemed like the man she had idolized as a child. "It doesn't have to be perfect. I just want to do it with you." After a moment of hesitation, Sarah nodded. "Okay, but I'm not very good at this." Robert chuckled softly. "Neither am I." They chose the painting of their family home, the one Sarah had noticed earlier. The image was incomplete, the outlines of the house sharp and clear, but the details of the garden and sky were unfinished, waiting for the touch of a brush. As they worked side by side, Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in years. The act of painting, of blending colors and filling in the gaps, felt strangely therapeutic. Robert's instructions were gentle and encouraging, his voice soft but filled with a passion that was contagious. "You're doing great," he murmured as Sarah hesitated over a stroke. "It's just a bush," she said with a laugh. "I don't think it's supposed to look this bad." "It's not about what it looks like," Robert replied. "It's about the time we're spending together." For the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to see Robert not as the father who had failed her, but as a flawed, vulnerable man who was trying to make amends. The realization was both painful and healing. As the evening wore on, Robert's energy waned, but he refused to stop. "Just a little longer," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But as Sarah was reaching for a new brush, Robert suddenly gasped, clutching his chest. "Dad!" Sarah cried, dropping the brush and rushing to his side. Megan, who had been tidying up the other side of the room, dashed over, her heart pounding. Robert's breathing was shallow, his face pale. Panic surged through Sarah as she looked to Megan for guidance. "I'll call James," Megan said urgently, already pulling out her phone. As the call connected and Megan explained the situation, Sarah gripped Robert's hand tightly, her voice trembling. "Dad, stay with me. Please." Robert's lips moved, but the words were too faint to hear. Sarah leaned closer, her heart breaking as she realized how fragile he had become. The sound of sirens in the distance signaled help was on the way, but the moment felt eternal. As Sarah sat by Robert's side, tears streaming down her face, she glanced at the painting they had been working on together. The house stood incomplete, just as their journey felt unfinished. The studio was silent except for the faint sound of Robert's labored breathing. Sarah sat beside his bed, her hands wrapped around his frail ones. Megan stood nearby, her presence a quiet comfort in the charged room. James adjusted the IV drip with practiced care, but the weight of inevitability hung heavy in the air. Robert's eyes fluttered open, his gaze settling on Sarah. His voice was barely above a whisper, each word a struggle. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she leaned closer. "I should have come sooner," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I let the anger and hurt build up for too long." Robert smiled faintly, his strength fading. "You came. That's what matters." Taking a deep breath, Sarah found the words she had held back for so many years. "I forgive you, Dad. I wish I'd said it earlier, but I'm saying it now. I forgive you." A tear slipped from the corner of Robert's eye as a faint, peaceful smile softened his features. His eyes closed, his hand relaxed in hers, and his breathing slowed until it stopped entirely. Sarah's shoulders shook as she buried her face in her hands. Megan placed a gentle hand on her back, offering silent solidarity. The stillness of the room felt unbearable, yet there was an undeniable sense of peace. The following days were a blur of grief and reflection. The studio became their sanctuary, a place where memories of Robert came alive in his work. Sarah found herself drawn to his journals and sketches, uncovering layers of his soul she hadn't known before. Each page told a story of regret, longing, and love, an artist's way of reconciling with his past. One evening, Megan handed Sarah a sealed envelope with both their names written on the front in Robert's shaky handwriting. Inside was a letter. "To Sarah and Megan, thank you for letting me find peace in my final days. Sarah, you were my greatest creation, and I hope you'll see that now. Your strength, your heart, they're a reflection of everything I wished I could have been for you. Never doubt how much you mean to me. Megan, you showed me that kindness doesn't go unnoticed. Your selflessness brought us back together, and for that, I will always be grateful. Keep spreading that light. It changes the world in ways you may never see. I leave the studio to you both. Sarah, I hope you'll turn it into a place where art can heal and bring people together, just as it has for us." Sarah pressed the letter to her chest, her tears soaking the paper. Megan smiled through her own tears. "He believed in you, Sarah, and so do I." Inspired by Robert's words, Sarah resolved to honor his final wish. Together, she and Megan began transforming the studio into a community space, a place where artists, families, and anyone in need of healing could come together. They planned the first exhibit to showcase Robert's life's work, including the painting Sarah had finished with him. It would be the centerpiece, a symbol of reconciliation and love. The day of the exhibit's opening arrived. The studio was alive with light and color, filled with people who had been touched by Robert's art. Sarah stood by the finished painting, her fingers brushing the frame. "We did this together," she whispered, feeling his presence in every stroke. That evening, after locking up the studio, Sarah noticed a small package on the doorstep. Inside was a faded photograph of her as a child, sitting on her father's lap while her mother smiled beside them. Tucked behind the photo was a note written in an unfamiliar hand. "Art keeps us alive, even when we're gone." Sarah held the photograph tightly, a soft smile playing on her lips. For the first time, she felt not just closure, but a sense of purpose. Robert's legacy wasn't just in his art, it was in the connections he'd rekindled and the love he'd left behind. As the story of Robert, Sarah, and Megan comes to a close, we're left with a profound reminder of the power of forgiveness, connection, and the legacy we leave behind. Robert's journey teaches us that it's never too late to seek reconciliation, even in the face of life's final moments. Sarah's courage to confront her pain and find closure inspires us to embrace vulnerability and take steps toward healing, no matter how difficult. And Megan, with her unwavering kindness, reminds us that even small acts of compassion can ripple outward, changing lives in ways we may never fully realize. What about you? Have you ever experienced a moment where kindness or forgiveness transformed a relationship in your life? Or perhaps there's someone you've been meaning to reconnect with but haven't found the right time? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories. If this story touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next story. Together, we'll continue exploring the depth of human experiences, uncovering tales that inspire, heal, and bring us closer together. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.